Hey everyone, ready to dive into something really interesting. Today, we're tackling Malaysia's strategy for dealing with climate change. Picture this, a country with incredible rainforests, beautiful beaches, and, modern cities too. But they're also really feeling the effects of climate change already. That's Malaysia, and their story, well, it's a real balancing act.
It is, yeah. How do you balance a growing economy with the need to address climate change?
Right.
That's the question.
Right. It's a tough one. And that's where their newly updated plan comes in. The National Climate Change Policy 2.0. We're
Yeah.
talking ambitious goals,
Yeah.
specific plans, and a real look at the challenges they're up against.
It's refreshing, actually. They're laying it all out there, the good, the bad, and the really difficult decisions they have to make.
No kidding. So should we get into it?
Let's do it.
Okay, so Malaysia is dealing with kind of a double whammy here, right? They're emitting a significant amount of those greenhouse gases, but they're also super vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's like they're feeling it from both sides.
Exactly. And that's the thing. They depend a lot on fossil fuels for their economy. But at the same time, they're already seeing the effects of, a warming planet. We're talking about rising temperatures, yeah, but also the economic hit from climate disasters. They can't just ignore it.
And they're not. The policy doesn't shy away from the problems at all. Right from the beginning, it talks about the dangers they're already facing. This isn't some far-off problem for them.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They're talking rising sea levels that could swallow up their coastlines, these crazy intense floods that just devastate communities, and then droughts that cripple their agriculture. All of that impacting their economy in a huge way.
And they've got the numbers to back it up. I mean, I knew Malaysia was prone to floods, but the policy mentioned something like RM 7.9 billion. Yeah, billion in losses just from floods since 2021.
It's a staggering number,
Yeah.
and it shows how much is at stake economically. But it's not just about, immediate damage. It's the long-term impact on industries like palm oil, which is a big deal for their economy. The policy even talks about how reduced yields because of climate change are a major concern.
Which makes sense. Palm oil is huge for them. So we've got their emissions contributing to the problem, and they're also very susceptible to the fallout. But before we go further, how much are they actually contributing to global emissions?
That's the thing, and it's kind of surprising. Despite everything, they contribute less than 1% of global emissions.
Less than 1%. Wow. That really puts things into perspective.
Right. It shows you how this is a global issue, that even countries with relatively small emissions, they can still experience really big impacts.
So it's on everyone, but the stakes are different all over the place.
Exactly. And that's what makes Malaysia so interesting to look at.
Yeah.
They're a developing nation with, a growing economy, but they're also on the front lines of climate change. They understand their position is unique.
Okay, so they're in a tough spot, but they're facing it head on. Let's dig into what they're actually planning to do. The policy lays out these 5, they call them strategic thrusts. They're like the main pillars of their strategy, right?
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. 5 main areas they're focusing on.
Makes sense. And the first one, it's interesting because it shows they're serious. You know what I mean? Like they're not just talking about it, they're actually setting things up to make it happen.
You're talking about the first thrust, strengthening climate governance and institutional capacity.
That's the one. I mean, it sounds kind of boring, right? Like bureaucratic jargon,
It does a bit, yeah.
but it's actually a big deal.
Oh, absolutely. This is the foundation, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're creating a whole new entity specifically for climate change that tells you they're moving beyond just talking. They're ready for action.
Exactly.
They even mention a whole new legal framework. Could be a dedicated climate change act. Imagine that.
Right.
This is about giving their goals some teeth, making things happen.
Okay, so they're getting organized, building the foundation. What about actually cutting down those emissions, though? That's got to be at the heart of this, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's thrust 2, low carbon development.
Mm-hmm.
This is where things get really interesting. Think about it trying to shift away from fossil fuels when your economy, it's so closely tied to them. That's their challenge.
That balancing act again, right? So what's the plan? Are they going all in on renewable energy?
Oh, they're aiming high, that's for sure. The policy sets a goal of 70% renewable energy by 2050.
Wow, 70%. That's ambitious. That's a huge jump.
Yeah.
What does that mean for their energy situation right now? Are they phasing things out or just adding more renewables on top?
It'll have to be both, really. They're going to need to scale up those renewables super fast while making some really tough decisions about, potentially phasing out things like coal power.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tough choices.
The policy acknowledges it, though.
Hmm.
It talks about those trade-offs. And that's
Yeah.
important, right? They're being realistic about the challenges. It's not just about, setting a goal and hoping for the best.
Right, right. It's got to be doable. And I guess that's where the National Energy Transition Roadmap comes in. It's like they've got a whole plan for this, not just pulling targets out of thin air.
Exactly. They've got a whole separate policy document just for that energy transition. We could do a whole other deep dive on that alone, probably. But the key takeaway is it's not just about going green because it sounds good.
It's about their survival, too, right? Economically, I mean. If the world is moving towards sustainability, they've got to keep up.
Exactly. The world is changing,
Hmm.
and they're making sure they're in a good position for the future. Investors are looking at sustainability more and more. Malaysia wants to be a good option.
Smart. Okay, so that's thrust two. Big push for clean energy. But there's another side to this, right? What about the stuff that's already happening because of climate change? The impacts they can't avoid. That's a whole other beast.
It is, yeah. And that's where thrust three comes in, adaptation and resilience. Because even if they completely stopped emissions today, right now, they'd still be feeling the effects of climate change for years to come.
No getting away from it.
No.
The policy lays it all out there, too. The floods, the sea level rise, the problems for agriculture. It's a lot to handle.
Yeah, and they're not sugarcoating it. Some of those visuals they've got in the document, especially the ones showing the floods and the coastal erosion, they're really powerful. They really give you a sense of what's at stake.
So how do they plan to deal with all that? Are we talking seawalls, moving communities? Give me the game plan.
It's a bunch of things, actually. They're definitely looking at those traditional infrastructure solutions, but they're also putting a lot of emphasis on nature-based solutions.
Mm.
I think that's really interesting.
Nature-based, what's that mean? Like, what are they actually doing?
Well, one thing they talk about is protecting mangroves.
Mangroves, okay.
Yeah, they act like a natural barrier, right?
Mm.
Against storms and rising sea levels. And bonus, they help absorb carbon from the atmosphere. It's a win-win.
Okay, I like that. Use nature to fight nature, right? What else?
They also talk about better urban planning to, lower the risks from floods, developing agriculture that can handle the changing climate. It's all about making sure that everything they do, all their development plans, consider climate resilience.
They're thinking about the big picture, how everything connects.
Yeah, they're realizing it's not environment or economy. They need each other. A healthy environment means a healthy economy and vice versa.
Makes sense to me. Okay, so we've got these plans switching to cleaner energy, dealing with the unavoidable impacts, but all this, it takes money. And I mean, serious money. Which brings us to the big question.
Hmm.
How are they going to pay for all of this?
That's the billion or, well, trillion ringgit question, isn't it?
Exactly.
And that's what Thrust 4 is all about, financing the green shift.
This is a tough one, honestly. Probably the biggest challenge of the whole thing. Because where are they going to find the resources for all this?
Exactly. It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
The policy mentions looking into carbon pricing, which could be really effective.
Carbon pricing, okay.
It can be a powerful tool, but it can also be pretty controversial. Basically, you put a price on those emissions to encourage companies to reduce them, but it's a tough sell sometimes, both politically and economically.
Interesting. They mention the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, too. Like it's a motivating factor for them.
Right.
It seems like they realize if they don't get their act together, they could be penalized by their trading partners. So now it's not just about the planet, it's about staying competitive, too.
Pragmatic, for sure.
Yeah.
They know they can't do it alone. That's why they're really focusing on attracting investment from the private sector, too.
Which makes sense. I mean, private companies, they have a huge role to play in developing and actually using all these new technologies. So is that it for the money part? Carbon pricing and hoping the private sector steps up?
Well, they mentioned a few other things, exploring green bonds, other innovative ways to raise funds. It's clear they're still figuring some of this out, but to be fair, it's a massive undertaking,
For sure. Okay, last but not least, thrust 5. Collaboration is key. Seems pretty self-explanatory. Climate change, it's a global problem, so you need a global response. Right.
Exactly. And they emphasize that a lot. International collaboration, working together within Malaysia, bringing in those local communities. It's about recognizing that no one has all the answers, and we're all in this together.
They specifically mention working with communities that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, which is really important. Because we can talk about the economics and all that, but it's people's lives that are being disrupted,
Absolutely. It's about making sure the transition is fair, that no one gets left behind.
Well said. So there you have it. Malaysia's big plan to deal with climate change. Ambitious, complex, lots of challenges. But the big question is, can they pull it off? So we've gone through it all. Malaysia's strategy, those 5 big strategic thrusts, all aimed at tackling climate change, right? But let's be real, are these really going to get them where they need to be, or is this just like wishful thinking?
That's the big question, right? And to their credit, they actually acknowledge in the policy that there are some big hurdles to overcome.
Yeah, it's never easy. So, what are they up against? What are the biggest challenges they're facing?
Well, remember how we were talking about that balancing act? Economic growth versus protecting the environment.
Right, right.
That's their main challenge. They're still developing as a nation, so economic growth is crucial. But they just can't ignore the environmental costs anymore.
Especially since they're, a big exporter of fossil fuels too. That adds a whole other layer, right?
Exactly. And the policy, it actually addresses that directly. They talk about a just transition for workers in those industries. It's not as easy as just shutting everything down overnight, right?
Right.
You've got real people, whole communities even, depending on those jobs.
Yeah, you can't forget about them.
Yeah.
So how are they planning to make sure no one's left behind in this?
Well, they talk about creating new job opportunities, programs to help people learn new skills and support for those communities to transition to something more sustainable. But that takes careful planning, resources, and time.
It's a process for sure.
Right.
Okay, so that's the economic side, that balancing act. What other big challenges did they point out?
Innovation. They need more of it. The policy talks about how they need more research and development to come up with their own solutions.
Okay, makes sense.
They can't just depend on importing technology from other countries. They have to be able to create things themselves, things that'll work for their specific situation.
Right, because they're facing unique challenges. One size fits all isn't going to work. Plus, it's a chance for them to, become leaders in this new green technology scene.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about the elephant in the room, the money.
The big one.
It's going to cost a lot to deal with the climate impacts they're already seeing. Plus, there's all the investment needed for the new stuff, the mitigation and adaptation strategies.
Trillions of ringgits, like we were saying. So how are they going to pay for it all?
They're looking at different options. We talked about carbon pricing, which has a lot of potential. And of course, they need that private sector investment. They mention green bonds too, and other innovative financing mechanisms.
It sounds like they're exploring all the options.
They are. Some of the details are still being worked out, but it's a huge undertaking, so that's understandable.
For sure. Well, I'd say it's pretty impressive. They have this plan, ambitious goals, and they're realistic about what they're up against. That's a good starting point, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. This policy provides a solid foundation, and that's crucial. The real test now is putting it into action. They're going to need to keep that momentum going, make sure all parts of the government are working together, get the private sector on board, and really involve those local communities.
It's a team effort for sure. Well, everyone, there you have it, our deep dive into Malaysia's balancing act with climate change. They've got their work cut out for them, but it'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
It will.
For those of you who want to learn more, we've included a link to Malaysia's full National Climate Change Policy 2.0 document in our show notes. It's worth checking out, even if you don't usually geek out on policy stuff. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the things that matter.